Hi, everyone, and welcome to another Living Life Naturally podcast. And today I'm thrilled to have Andrea Claassen, and she is an Ayurvedic wellness counselor and postpartum doula. She's also an RYT 500-hour yoga teacher and wild woman circle leader who's been in the wellness space since 2007. And her mission is to help you start a life of cyclical alignment with the seasons using Ayurveda as your guide. And she does this by teaching her peaceful power practices centered around movement, mindfulness, and Mother Nature, of course, through an Ayurvedic lens. So you can hear more about Andrea and her Peaceful, Powerful podcast, where she aims to deliver actionable takeaways for you live. I will put all of that information for you. It's on her website, and she'll give you that later on in the show. So welcome, Andrea. We're so thrilled to have you here today.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here, Lynn.
So will you tell our people where you're joining from?
Yeah, I'm in St. Paul, Minnesota.
And what's the weather like in Minnesota right now?
It is gorgeous out today, so I will take it.
Good. So tell us a little bit about your journey and what brought you to the Ayurvedic type of medicine.
Yeah. So I first discovered Ayurveda when I was in the jungles of Costa Rica, and a yoga teacher was like, Andrea, you're very much a Pitta dosha. And I had no idea what that meant, but I was curious. And so immediately I got back from this retreat, signed up for a yoga teacher training, had no idea, that yoga teacher trainings, they have probably about 1 to 3 hours of Ayurveda actually in them. And I learned just a little bit. And so I wanted more. And I actually, at the end of my yoga teacher training, I gave birth to my first son, who is now 7.5. And at that time, I was a personal trainer, and I thought, I can, bounce back and everything is going to be fine. But then it wasn't. And I felt a little out of sorts mentally, physically. And then I decided, hey, I'm going to discover this Ayurveda again. And so I went back down kind of that Ayurvedic rabbit hole, so to speak. And that was where my healing began postpartum, was through an Ayurvedic lens and really diving into my first year-long Ayurvedic program. And from there, I just kind of dove even deeper, and I've studied it now for many years. And it's something that I found healing in with that initial postpartum. And now I have a 5-month-old as well. And I will say I healed much better this time because I did all the practices ahead of time. And then now postpartum, I followed the Ayurvedic lens.
So I know we're going to chat today about perimenopause and menopause tips, again, through this Ayurvedic lens, which is very interesting to me. So how does Ayurveda view menopause?
Yeah, so Ayurveda looks at menopause a little bit differently than the West. It's kind of the time where we're really looking at honoring our wisdom and all of the life experiences that we've had. And so they are very big in looking back through the years. Sometimes we can kind of get stuck in old, maybe, when we were 30, we get stuck on a story. And then, we kind of go backwards instead of go forwards. Ayurveda really tries to help you kind of push past, so we're not clinging to some of those past, versions of ourselves. And that's kind of the same in that postpartum period too. Very similar. It helps you move through some of those tougher life transitions. And so a lot of that inner work is done there. Now, from an actual, what are some practices? There are practices that we boost the ojas. And so that's kind of our vital energy. And so going into menopause, you really want to start working on this in the perimenopause years to have that vital energy flowing and going. And that might look like honoring the time to rest, especially because, we get into those years of our life where we might be go, 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 go. And then all of a sudden, we hit this wall and we've lost that energy and that kind of ojas or that sparkle about us. And so that's something that we work on building. There's different foods you can have, such as honey. We have this thing called Chyawanprash. It's kind of like a jam. And that's something that can be taken every day. You have almonds are actually great for ojas. Milk tonics are something that I always recommend as well, which is just heating up some milk on the stove and then putting in herbs depending on what your constitution or dosha needs are, to make it perfect for you. Dates are also another great ojas building food. So all of those are just simple ways that Ayurveda looks at like transitioning from that perimenopause to menopause years to help build up that vital energy that you're going to need.
And I love the way that they talk about in Ayurveda the wisdom, because so many of us, when we reach the menopausal years, we kind of tend to think, life's changed so much. It's the end of an era, and yet we can bring in so much wisdom to people. We've learned so much over the years. And so I love the way that they do think about wisdom.
Yeah. And just as we honor kind of the first bleeds and we have kind of the red tent ceremonies, it's kind of the same thing as you go into menopause. Having ceremonies with your friends and celebrating that transition is also, I think, something I'm seeing more of in the spaces now, as I just gave birth, but I'm almost 40. And so I'm kind of in that perimenopause is right around the corner. And I've had a lot of friends who are kind of juggling that. Okay, we've just had a baby, but we're also transitioning at the same time. So there's lots of things going on that I'm seeing, and honoring those, phases. I think we're doing a much better job now than we used to.
Yes. So I think back to the years when my mother went through it. I mean, it was just something you didn't talk about. And there was so much misinformation out there, or the fact that you really couldn't talk about it. And nowadays we're beginning to talk about it, and it's such a good thing because it's such a natural phase for us all to go through. And instead of dreading it and we tend to stop living in the present at this point in life, just really, as you say, honoring this period of life. Because to me, this is only halfway through our lives. Think about you. Okay, you're 40, you're not even halfway through your life. We've got so much to be thankful for. And instead of being negative about it, putting in that positivity.
Yeah. And I think that's where that transition and just honoring, that's why I like the ceremonies, just to honor that, hey, this is the new phase. And you'll find people who are like, where has this been all of my life? That's kind of one of the things I do with my wild women circles. I have people of all ages, and it's really nice because you have people there sharing from different phases of life. And we never coach, which is also nice at our circles. Is just, hey, I need to get this off my chest. And they just put it into the circle. And it's sometimes all you need is that medicine of just, I got to release this. This is what I'm clinging on to, and then do it with strangers. And I find that sometimes is just the magic of finding that, women's circle.
So what, from an Ayurvedic perspective, what are the top 3 areas to focus on during menopause?
So I would say the first one I hear a lot of complaint is sleep. And so really focusing on sleep hygiene. What does that look like? And sometimes I have many clients who are like, yep, can't sleep. I get on my phone or instant thing, or I get on a tablet. And so at 2 a.m., you might not, be sleeping. So you get on a device. That's not going to help. That's not going to help you at all. I will say, from breastfeeding right now in the middle of the night, when I get up my phone, like I'm doing it so I don't fall asleep right now. And it does work. And so if you're thinking, hey, I don't think it's working, it really is. It does keep you awake, and that's not helping you get back to sleep. So having those phone boundaries, even at night, 2 hours before bed is what Ayurveda recommends. So you're off your phone, off tablets. Some people are really TV sensitive as well. So they'll have to get off TV a couple hours before bed. You can kind of play with that. I found that doesn't really affect me, but I do have some people who are really sensitive to that, and they have to shut everything down. And then having that routine. And so, whether that be like a meditation at night to calm down the mind, whether that be a little bit of movement. So depending again on your dosha, you might, if you're a kapha, you might want more movement, some gentle yoga stretches. If you're that pitta, you might want that cooling breath work practice to release some of that built up heat. And then vata, you just might want to sit and meditate just to calm the mind down. And so those are some things with the sleep hygiene that you might want to practice. Another area that we're looking at is cooling practices. And so honoring the moon. And so the moon is something that we, you might notice, like as we're recording this, it's a full moon right now. It's a great time to get outside underneath the full moon And whether you just sit by a fire, whether you just go outside and practice moon salutations, which you can just, Google and you'll be able to find a quick little sequence. Whether you just go out barefoot and just stand underneath the moon, those are all little cooling practices to the body that, our ancestors, used to do, but we've lost kind of ways with that. And so Ayurveda really honors the moon and the cooling energies it provides. And then the last one is really paying attention to exercise. And from that personal training background, there are different, ways and many different opinions on exercise. In Ayurveda, we go till there's like a light sweat. And so once you have just a light sweat, that's all you really need. And so whether that be strength training, whether that be going for walks, whether that be yoga, whatever kind of that exercise looks like for you, it's whatever you're going to do consistently. Because at the end of the day, if you're not going to consistently, be exercising, something is better than nothing. So I'm all for people, if they're just going to go for walks, do that. If that's your consistent practice. Here in Minnesota in the winter, many people go into the malls and you can walk the malls. If you're like, I want to walk outside, but they live in a place where it gets really cold. Yes, malls are a great option.
So you've mentioned several things there that people might not be familiar with the type of people you are, and they may not even be familiar with Ayurvedic practices. So share just a little about what that means.
Yeah, so Ayurveda, it originated in India over 5,000 years ago. And the best way that you kind of think about it, it's a mother nature practice. We're looking at what's happening outside of our windows is happening in our body. So on these warmer summer hot days, that's going to increase our body temperature. And so if you're in menopause and you're experiencing hot flashes and you're out for a walk at noon on a 90-degree day in summer, it's really going to exacerbate that condition. And so in Ayurveda, we look at opposites heal. So instead of going out at that time, you're thinking, okay, those moon practices you talk about, going out for an evening walk when the sun has gone down, that's going to be more cooling to my body. So we kind of navigate like increases like and opposites heal. So if you are feeling the hot and just kind of the, just the sweaty, you're going to want cooling practices. If you're feeling dry, you're going to want to bring in some more wetness. So whether that be Abhyanga, we call it self-massage to help with the body, which I also highly recommend for perimenopause, menopause, menstrual cycle, everything. Abhyanga is really wonderful to kind of help give the skin some moisture. And that's just a self-massage practice with, it can be sesame oil is kind of the universal oil. The cooking oil that you cook with is the one. Personally, I don't like to smell like that. So I make my own lavender oil. So there's other oils that you can use if you want, but that's a wonderful practice. And then if you're feeling stuck and mucus and stagnant, that's where movement comes into play. So that's kind of that kapha dosha that I talked about. Sometimes the flip side is you do get stuck and stagnant. And so having that, whether it be a walk, whether it be yoga, whether it be a more intense breath work practice, those are ways to kind of help get some of that stuckness away from our body.
So then from your perspective, tell women how they can actually prepare for menopause.
So in Ayurveda, perimenopause is something that's it's new. It was not written about in ancient texts because it wasn't around. They really only had the menstrual cycle and menopause. And so many of my teachers say that's why I'm passionate about working with people in the menstrual cycle years, because you can fix it and have no issues going into menopause. Like my mom, perfect example, no issues with menopause. She was like, I wouldn't have known it except for, my period disappeared. Other than that, she had no symptoms. And so that means she did a really good job during her menstrual cycle years. And so she didn't have those things that her friends would say that they were complaining about. And so if the sooner you can kind of follow some of the Ayurvedic practices and staying in balance with kind of your dosha needs with the seasons, the better you're going to be as you transition into perimenopause and into menopause. Now, Ayurveda also says if you're more of a kapha constitution, sometimes you have an easier adjustment with menopause, which my mom has more kapha than I do. So I'm going to have to be probably going to do more practices than my mom, just because her innate nature is going to be an easier transition, which it was for her, into those menopausal years. And so those are some of the things that we're looking at is how can we start doing these things now, which would be living in sync with your cycle. And so perimenopause, really, Ayurveda says you should be following what we kind of do during the menstrual cycle years. There is no kind of in between. You can do the same things if you experience them during perimenopause as you do with the menstrual cycle years. So I usually coach kind of that group of people all the same, because it really is, at the end of the day, it's about balancing and finding your unique doshic needs. And depending again on whether you have that dryness, that heat, that mucus, that stagnant energy, we kind of are working on finding the opposite approach to help heal it. And then again, hopefully you'll transition into menopause and nothing will bother you.
But for so many of our listeners, they're probably not prepared, and they're probably in the middle of all of this perimenopausal stuff. So how can they ease common hormonal complaints?
So the good news is it's never too late to start. So even if you are feeling that in perimenopause, and I've worked with many people, the best way to start is, okay, what are you experiencing? So let's say we'll just pick like PMS, like you have intense PMS, and you're experiencing it a couple days before your cycle. So we might look at some liver practices. So castor oil packs are something that we might recommend, and doing those once a week. We might look at some diet needs. So, whether it's reducing caffeine, alcohol, dandelion root tea is something that's great. Having oat straw and raspberry leaf tea infusions are something that I really like to give to people who are experiencing intense cramps, and having that, it can be daily, it can be once a week. Those are some different practices that I would do just based on, okay, here's what I'm experiencing. Yoni steaming is also something that we would recommend, and that can be done depending on what you're treating. There's different herbs that, we can put together based on, is it stuck stagnant blood? Is it excess blood? Are you having, trouble getting your cycle going? It's a little scant in the beginning and then it gets heavier, or it's just always scant. There's herbs that we kind of mix together and do yoni steam recommendations. And that would be done. Usually it's just 20 minutes, maybe a couple times a week, depending on what you're working with, except for during your bleeding. You don't usually do yoni steams or castor oil packs. I don't recommend either while you're actually bleeding, because sometimes that increases the flow, which some people already have an intense flow. Mm-hmm. We don't want to necessarily do that. So those are some, different practices that I would recommend. And again, it's going to be a little different. So I don't want to give like a general here, this, right. But in general, those are some of the practices we would recommend and tweak based on, what dosha needs that I would see.
So you've mentioned dosha needs quite a bit. What exactly is a dosha need?
So your doshas, you can read either you can take your pulse. And so that's one way that I kind of read people. And so we were born a dosha, we call it your prakriti. And so that's your set point. That's kind of your balance. Typically, that's when you feel your best, is you're like, yep, I feel really good here. Vikriti is your dosha that's imbalance. It's something that you don't quite feel like yourself. So maybe you are, we'll say you're pitta. So I'm a pitta. You're pretty steady. I'm pretty even. I'm a to-do list person. I'm a go, go, go. Now my vata tends to be the one that goes out more, which is scattered, which is kind of all over the place. You can lose train of thought. You can be talking to someone and then you forget where you're going with your sentence. So that's kind of that vata. And I know when I'm starting to go out there, problem is sometimes I don't mind it, because sometimes you need that vata energy. It's the creative energy. And so my goal is to always find that balance so I don't tip too far out on my vata dosha. Now, your kapha dosha is kind of that steady mama earth energy. Kapha dosha is like, I've given people hugs before and I'm like, I don't know why I'm hugging you. It's just a grounded presence. And they're really, they're the givers. So a lot of the times, the imbalance of a kapha is they've just given, haven't done anything for themselves. And then they feel a little bit stuck, stagnant. They're stuck on their couch. Netflix and chill is kind of their default if they've given away everything they have. So that's kind of, we all have positives and negatives to each of these doshas. So there's not one that's better than the other, but they all have different, we have all three within ourselves, just in varying amounts. And everyone has a different amount. And it's kind of about finding that unique amount for you. And then that's where the seasonal element comes into play, because we're also looking. So as we're in summer, that is that pitta, that is that fire energy. And being a pitta dosha, I just have to be mindful of, for myself, not going out for like a run at noon, under that hot sun. That's going to infuriate that pitta. And so there's just different practices that you might do. Like I might go for a run early in the morning or late at night. Or I tell clients too, hey, if you have to go for that run at noon, because that's the only time you have, what are you going to do to balance the pitta energy the rest of the day? You know, making sure that you have built in some self-care practices so you're not going to overdo things. Making time for meditation, making time maybe not to work a ton that day. Can you take a little time off, you know, later in your day? So that's how we kind of work with those dosha energies. And again, we all kind of know our set point once we're kind of in tune with it. And sometimes it's about peeling those layers away so you can find, here's my balance. Here's kind of that energy I'm at.
So many times for women who are in perimenopause, especially, they're so imbalanced with their hormones. So how does Ayurveda help with hormonal balance?
Yeah. So again, we're coming back to some of those practices. So they don't, in the text, they don't recommend, I mean, they don't have anything for estrogen or progesterone in particular. They do have practices, or I've found teachers who've since said, here's what I think, you know, Ayurveda would recommend. And so progesterone is a really great one to do because it's very easy. You go outside in nature, you give more hugs, you laugh. Like those are some of the things that Ayurveda would recommend for progesterone, not necessarily going on a supplement. Excess estrogen, same thing. You're going to do those castor oil packs. You're going to look at, okay, do you have too much caffeine going on? Is there too much alcohol going on? What are you eating? How's your digestion? That's usually the top thing, is we call it Agni. So if you're not able to digest your food, it's going to get stuck. And now the liver is working overtime. And so that's going to potentially lead to that excess estrogen as well. Because that's usually the first place that I start with everyone is, how's your digestion? And, you know, we need to be having regular bowel movements in Ayurveda. They say daily. And that's something that's not always happening. And I just saw articles here in the West and they were debating. One week it said it's okay to go 4 or 5 days. And then the next day they had an article and it said that you shouldn't do that. So, I mean, that's where Ayurveda stays steady at. It needs to be every day. It needs to be banana shaped. It needs to be, you know, it's not going to be many of my clients have the constipation with, it's the rabbit pellets. It's the harder things. That's constipation in Ayurveda. And so you're going to be working with, okay, I got to improve my digestion before anything else. Because if I can't digest things, everything is just going to keep backing up into that liver.
And how in Ayurveda do you actually help the digestive issues?
There are many different ways. So first I usually do a 2-week food log for people and just kind of look and don't have people change. So I always tell people, just be as honest as you can, write down everything. And then we see, how is your actual movements? I also have people write their cycle day, because sometimes I hear constipation right before, you know, you bleed is often a common complaint. And so we look at all of these factors. And first we might look at food pairings and combinations. So there's different things that milk isn't great with a lot of foods because it's too hard to digest. And drinking cold milk on that is really hard to digest. They always recommend kind of gently cooking it or warming it. Same thing with water. That's one of the first things I do. Room temperature water, if possible, not ice cold water, even on hot days. Because that, if we think about those digestive fires, you're putting that ice on a fire, you know, the fire is going to flame out. And so that's where we're kind of finding that balance. Other areas that we're going to look at eating the largest meal ideally is between that 10 and 2 time. That's when our digestive fires are the biggest. And then early lighter dinner, which could be 6 o'clock for some people. It could be 4:30 for people. Finding what time is going to work best for you, depending on work schedules. But ideally eating at least 2 hours before bed. So when you hit the pillow, your food is digested. And then again, lighter, you know, not having a heavier steak or meat in the evening. If you're going to eat meat, that noon hour is going to be easier for you to digest it. So those are some of the biggest things that we kind of switch around. And often I find if you're going to do anything, the first thing I start with is lunch is your biggest meal, early lighter dinner. And that works really well, especially for people in perimenopause and menopausal years. That tends to be one of the biggest things where people feel better. They have more energy. You might feel a little sluggish the first week or two, but then once you've kind of made it through and your digestion and your body's used to flipping those two around, most people are like, oh, this is great. I'm not going to go back to a heavy dinner at night.
Yeah, I hear that so often. So I know that you work a lot with people in menstrual cycles. And so what happens at the end of the perimenopausal years and you stop having your menstrual cycle? Is there something that you can do to balance your body?
Yeah. So pretty much all of the practices, these would be the main things. We kind of look at the sleep, the diet, lifestyle are kind of three main pillars in Ayurveda. And if we're going to look at anything, we look at those three things first and then make adjustments, depending on what area, is not flowing for you. And then, whether that be, the yoni steams, the infusions that you're drinking, switching what you're eating. Those would be the first practices that we would kind of go to.
Mm. Yeah, and what about from an emotional perspective? Because we go through so much in those years, is there anything that Ayurveda does to balance that out?
Yeah, so you're working on releasing. And so we kind of call it apanavayu, is that down and out. And so you could do mudras, hand mudras. You could do a journal practice. You can be kind of shouted out, like releasing. So a lot of times I have clients who love to take a pillow, slam it down and yell. I always like to, in yoga classes, give permission for people just to sigh it out and, and usually it's my clients who are in that perimenopause, menopause years, the only ones who will do it. Everyone else might be a little bit shy, but they're like, yes, I need to release, which is great because just little releases like that are ways in Ayurveda that we're kind of releasing. And then any deep stuff, I always recommend, seeing a therapist, and that would be your next, step. If there's something that like, I'm really struggling with getting over XYZ, but those would be the practices we would recommend of just the little things that you can do at home. If there's anything bigger, seeking different help.
Mm. And where can people find you?
Yeah, it's just my website is my name, AndreaClaassen.com. And then I just have Ayurvedic consults over there. And so people can kind of book a consult with me. I have a Flow with Your Cycle program, which is for anyone in, menstrual cycle, perimenopause years, and menopause. I have people who are close to menopause. And, we work with how are we going to balance the hormones, what's going on. And, here are the tools that you can do to feel better.
Great. They'll all be in the show notes. But do you have any last tips or words of wisdom you'd like to share with our listeners?
Yeah, I mean, really in Ayurveda, it all starts with what can you digest? So maybe this week paying attention to your digestion, how are you feeling? Is this food really digesting? If it's coming out in your stools, like I had clients who were like, quinoa is coming out in my stool. So we remove it because it's not digesting. It's just going right through. So that would be the tip I would say for everyone to recommend is just kind of look at your digestion and see what you feel like after meals.
That's a great tip. And that's, of course, learning your body again, where journaling comes in so useful with writing down what you're eating.
Yes.
Yeah. So thanks. I really appreciate you coming on and joining us today. And I would encourage people to check out in the show notes where you can find Andrea. And then also remember that when it comes to perimenopause, I'm your menopause queen, and I would love to hop on a quick call with you. So you'll find that information in the show notes too. Thank you all for joining us today. Thank you, Andrea, for all of your input. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
You have been listening to the Living Life Naturally podcast, where we're on a mission to inform, inspire, and encourage women to live their best life confidently, joyfully, and freely from what's been holding them back. For show notes and free resources, visit holistic-healthandwellness.com. And I'd be delighted if you'd follow us on socials to connect further. If you enjoyed this show, why not share it with your friends? If you found good value, chances are they will too. And of course, a 5-star review on iTunes is always greatly appreciated, as much as I appreciate you listening. So until next time, live life naturally and joyfully.